Hello. It wasn't till late last night we got the last few nail-biting results. So settle in. This morning we'll crunch the complete election picture. Nightmare for the Tories, jubilation for Labour. Here, there and everywhere, Keir Starmer's showing Labour's back on the pitch. In Blackpool, North Yorkshire, and with only 1,000 votes in it, a new mayor in the West Midlands. A narrow victory, but a huge win.
We've just got chaos and division from the Tories. People want to turn the page on that.
Obviously, it's disappointing to lose good, hard-working Conservative councillors. I'm focused completely on the job at hand.
The Conservatives clamouring to concentrate on its victory on Teesside. But who was the winner here? Ben Houchen, the local mayor who hung on, who says Sunak is safe for now.
The idea that people in the Conservative Party think we can change Prime Minister yet again, whoever that may be, and still think we have any chance of winning the next general election is for the birds. But
the council results were dire for the Tories, with all the nerves that creates for the general election.
That's quite a swing, isn't it? I mean, you'd be toast if there was a 16% swing to Labour, wouldn't you?
These results might sketch out the political future. So this morning, what might it hold? Morning, morning. With us to reflect on the winners and the losers, Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, and Pat McFadden, Labour's campaign chief. How much sleep have you had between you over there? Mark, how many hours of sleep have you had?
Not enough.
Not enough. Pat, how about you?
The same. Elections used to be one night and one day. Now it's a whole weekend.
Goodness me. Well, we've all got the coffee on, so I hope you've got some at home too, because with us as well this morning, the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. She's warning the Tories are facing wipeout if they don't change. With us throughout, here with me at the desk, Conservative former Minister Paul Scully. Welcome to you. Scoop getter extraordinaire, Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Guardian, and former Labour Cabinet Minister Jackie Smith, who your old council from your old seat has gone red, so you've got quite a lot to smile about this morning. We've also been speaking to Yolande Makolo from the Rwandan government. Will ministers' controversial plans to deport thousands of migrants work? More of that later, but let's start with the big headlines this morning. The Telegraph splashes with Labour's mayoral victories. Keir Starmer tells The Observer there needs to be an election to end the zombie government. The Sunday Express says we're doomed and says Rishi Sunak is a lame duck. But no sign of the election on the Mail front page, which talks about the King. And the Mirror has a royal story too about Prince Andrew's crumbling home. Welcome to you, our trio at the desk. Paul, looking at these results, what message do you think the public sent to your party?
I think they've sent a really hard message for us to take, that, we're in a very mad place as the Conservative Party. It's always brutal for councillors that take the brunt of that. And you've seen from Andy Street when he's done a fantastic job in the West Midlands, and Birmingham have been bankrupted by a Labour council, but he's still, again, taken the brunt of that. We need people like Ben Houchen now to take up the mantle and actually showcase how Conservatives can govern in a moderate way. But we've got to take a breath as a national party, show a bit of humility.
Jackie, what message do you take from it?
Well, I think the message we can read is from Redditch, where I fought my first election over 30 years ago, through to Rushmore, the home of the British Army. Labour were winning across local government. In the Blackpool South by-election, enormous swing to Labour there. And in the West Midlands last night, where some thought we weren't going to win, we did. And these are the sorts of areas that Labour needs to win for victory in a general election. And as Keir Starmer says, let's stop messing about, put the country first, let's have a general election as soon as possible.
And Pippa, looking at both sides, and maybe even the smaller parties, we'll talk about them at the end of the programme, but what's your analysis of what we've seen?
It looks like the national polling that we've seen consistently putting Labour ahead for months now is pretty accurate, and that we're in a situation that looks pretty bad for Rishi Sunak going into the general election. I mean, there was one by-election, which is obviously the only parliamentary seat, but even there, the Reform Party was snapping at the heels of the Conservatives, almost beat them to second place, and Labour won back that seat with a huge swing, which, if replicated in similar areas across the country, would mean that Keir Starmer is a dead cert for Downing Street.
But just briefly, what about that other set of calculations that actually suggest maybe there's only 9 points difference in the overall share? So Labour isn't guaranteed a majority.
Well, I think it looks at the moment that Labour will be in Downing Street. But as you say, it's about how big that majority ends up being, and that will be crucial for them in terms of how they end up running the country and what sort of freedom Keir Starmer has. Labour has some way to go. I think the interesting thing about this set of results is that it showed that they are winning in all sorts of different types of places. So winning back 2019 type areas that they lost to Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, winning in Brexit areas again, and also their own vote was holding up in some of their sort of key support as well.
Well, in any election, the map is always just as important as the numbers in a way. So the big headlines, as we've been hearing, a disastrous set of results for the Tories in lots of places, the loss of all bar one of the 11 mayoral contests, defeat in the Blackpool South by-election with a massive swing to Labour, and third place in the council elections after the Lib Dems in terms of the totals. The Prime Minister is fond of saying, stick to the plan, but if voters don't seem to like it much, what now? Well, Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, is with us this morning. Thank you for coming in. You're warning of a wipeout or a political earthquake. Why?
The plan's not working, and I despair at these terrible results. There's no spinning these results. There's no disguising the fact that these have been terrible election results for the Conservatives, and they suggest that we are heading to a Labour government, and that fills me with horror. I love my country, I care about my party, and I want us to win. And I'm urging the Prime Minister to change course, to, with humility, reflect on what the voters are telling us, and change the plan and the way that he's communicating and leading us.
If it's that dire, why not change the leader?
Listen, I just don't think that's a feasible prospect right now. We don't have enough time, and it's impossible for anyone new to come and change our fortunes, to be honest. There's no Superman or Superwoman out there who can do it. Rishi Sunak has been leading us for about 18 months. He's been making these decisions. These are the consequences of those decisions. He needs to own this, and therefore he needs to fix it.
What does he need to do differently then? You say he must change course, but what would that look like?
I think the problem is that our voters are on strike. They're not coming out to support us. We've seen that with the turnouts, and we've seen that by losing Conservative strongholds. When I was knocking on doors in the Midlands, in London, in the South Coast, Conservative voters were saying to me very often, we're lifelong voters of your party, but you're not a Conservative party anymore, and we can't vote for you. So what does the Prime Minister need to do? I think he needs to show people that he really cares about some of the things that he's talked about. He needs to actually lower taxes in a way that people will feel, not tweaking around the edges. If he's serious about migration, he needs to put a cap on legal migration. He needs to take us out of the European Convention on Human Rights. That's how you actually send the message that he's serious about stopping the votes.
But where's your evidence that those kinds of changes would make any difference? Because Rishi Sunak has cut taxes in the last few months. He has hardened the laws on migration. He has, by some people in your party, moved too far to the right. So where's your evidence that a further move would get your voters back?
The evidence is that people are not voting for what he's doing because they don't believe that we are serious about some of these issues. They don't believe that we're serious about some of these issues because they don't feel the benefits. On tax cuts, if he made a bold and big offer on cutting income tax or raising the personal thresholds, people would actually feel the benefits of those tax cuts because we're tweaking and we're just tightening some of the nuts and the bolts in a complex system rather than actually making a meaningful offer to people. People are not convinced by what we're saying.
But where the Conservative Party's put up a candidate who appeared to many people to be on the right in London, she lost.
Listen, in London, we lost because of the National Party's mismanagement of the process. They botched the selection process a year ago, and then really speaking, they didn't run a good campaign. The candidate was unsupported, and that's why we lost.
Are there ministers in government who share your view? That
yes.
All is, yes.
Of course. I talk to many of my colleagues who are privately demoralised and incredibly concerned about the prospects. We are, at this rate, we'll be lucky to have any Conservative MPs at the next election. And we need to fight. And I'm not willing to give up. It does me no favours to come here and say it how it is and to set out the difficult situation that we're in. But I owe that honesty to my colleagues. I owe that to you and the British people who are crying out for a Conservative party to vote for.
Except I think some of our viewers might feel this morning, and some others in your party might feel, actually, it's people who have been criticising the Prime Minister in public, people who have been playing political games and thinking about their own futures that are part of the problem here.
I reject that. Listen, I'm not in government. I'm not making the decisions on our policies. I'm not there putting forward legislation to ban smoking and to vote on pedicabs. We voted more on pedicabs and on banning smoking. I voted against it. Than we've voted on meaningful healthcare reform or fixing social care or improving mental health care. We are not delivering for the people. We're not delivering the policies that people want. And it's a disgrace that we are trailing up against Labour, led by Keir Starmer, who has the charisma of a peanut, who is overseeing a party which is a rabble of hard left maniacs, who would undo Brexit, who would open our borders, and who would indoctrinate our institutions and our schools with politically correct madness.
But given all the changes
be trailing to the degree that we are against this Labour Party.
But given all the turmoil you've had, all the changes of leader, all the noises of all the civil war, all the belly aching, do you believe, though, that there will be viewers thinking, actually, it's the Conservatives who are a rabble? And can you tell us, was there a plot being discussed to get rid of Rishi Sunak this week if everything was bad? And is it over?
What I would say is that there's no point blaming those of us who are telling the truth for the problems that we're facing. As I said, I'm not in charge, I'm not in government. These decisions on policy and communication and campaigns are being made by Rishi Sunak and his team.
Was there a plot?
I don't. You tell me. I read what you read in the papers, and if the papers and journalists seem to like this subject about plotting and plotters.
Well, it's important because it's about who's going to be the Prime Minister of our country. Do you regret backing Rishi Sunak?
Honestly, yes, I do, because I had assurances from Rishi Sunak that he was going to put a cap on legal migration, that he was going to do something about the European Convention on Human Rights, that he was going to fix this transgender ideology in our schools. He hasn't done that. I want our party to win. I want us to beat this feeble Labour Party, and I want to save our country from Keir Starmer. I'm not going to give up. I'm still going to fight, even if it makes me unpopular. I'm going to speak the truth, because that's what the 400 councillors who we lost this week deserve. That's what the authorities that we lost this week deserve. We are not going to fix this problem unless we're honest about it and we change course in reflection with some humility to what the voters are telling us.
OK, Suella Braverman, thanks very much indeed for coming in this morning, and we'll be putting your points to Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, in a few moments. Before we do that, let's just remind you what happened this week in all those contests around the country and what they add up to. We've asked the pollster Luke Trill to give us his 3 top trends, and we start with the by-election in Blackpool South.
The question was, could Labour match the swings we've seen elsewhere this Parliament? And the answer was yes. In fact, Labour secured the 3rd highest swing to them since the Second World War. And you can see how Labour's by-election performance has improved over the course of this Parliament. What about Ben Houchen's victory in Tees Valley? Can the Conservatives take any comfort from that? Well, the truth is, Ben Houchen has a big personal vote, and you can see that by comparing how he did to how we'd expect a generic Tory to do based on national voting intention. In the West Midlands, though, Andy Street's personal vote wasn't quite enough to carry him over the line, although again, he still outperformed how you'd expect the Conservatives to do. Finally, what about the projected national share? That's how we might expect the parties to do if the whole of Britain was voting. Well, before they took office the year later, we saw Tony Blair 16 points ahead of the Conservatives, David Cameron was 15 points ahead of Labour, Keir Starmer just 9 points ahead of the Conservatives in this round of elections. So does that mean the general election might be closer than we've come to expect? Maybe. But you've also got to remember that in local elections, lots of people vote for smaller parties, and they're unlikely to do the same in a general election. which of course is still some months away.
Well, Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, has been taking it all in. Thank you for coming to see us this morning. You'll have heard there Suella Braverman, your former colleague, has essentially said you have to change your approach or you're going to die when it gets to the general election.
Well, it's two aspects to that, I think. First of all, I mean, you obviously had a piece on polling there. If you look at the analysis that Rawlings and Thrasher have done, acknowledged experts, it says that the performance over the last few days means we're looking at a hung parliament, so Labour wouldn't get a majority. That's a better position. That means the election's outcome's closer than the polls are suggesting. So my read from that is it's all to play for. The election isn't a foregone conclusion and you shouldn't take the voters for granted.
You're saying it's all to play for.
So it's all to play for.
All of these councillors around the country,
So
you've lost everything apart from the mayoral election results.
Yes, I think the national equivalent vote share, the analysis that's been done by Rawlings and Thrasher and that thing there showed that it's closer than the national polls. You shouldn't take the voters for granted. It's everything to fight for. There's a lot to do. I absolutely acknowledge that. On the point about policy, I think the Prime Minister is focusing on what the country's priorities are. So that's about reducing taxes on working people. We've done that twice already this year. That takes time to feed through. Focusing on stopping the boats. We've got the Rwanda legislation on the books and now we need to see flights taking off. And then the final area is obviously priorities on reducing waiting lists for the National Health Service. Those are the country's priorities and those are the Prime Minister and the government's priorities.
But you say you're focusing on the country's priorities. The country is telling you at the ballot boxes that it doesn't like what you are doing. It doesn't want to choose the Conservatives at the moment in all sorts of different contests, in all sorts of different corners of the country. And from both sides of your party here this morning, from Paul Scully, who would, I think, say he's a centre, moderate Conservative, and from Suella Braverman, they have both told us very plainly, now is the moment where you have to show humility, you have to take a breath, and you have to do things differently.
Look, I'm not going to pretend that the election results over the last few days were disappointing. They're disappointing to lose hard-working local councillors. I was particularly disappointed by the nail-biting, narrow result yesterday in the West Midlands. As Transport Secretary, I've worked very closely with Andy Street.
And you cancelled his leg of HS2, which he didn't want you to do.
He's a fantastic mayor. No, and look, that illustrates, I think, something really important about the Prime Minister. He's interested in taking difficult decisions that might not be popular with everyone, but that are in the long-term interests of the country.
They weren't in the long-term interests of Andy Street.
And are the right decision. Well, I disagree. Every single penny of the money we save from cancelling the second phase of HS2 is being reinvested in transport. And I was in the West Midlands just a few weeks ago with Andy Street for the launch of a £1.75 billion Midlands rail hub, improving the connectivity of Birmingham across the country.
But the point here, Secretary of State, is that it's not just about what happened in the last couple of days, which in many places for you is dire. You got hammered in the local council elections last year as well. You've lost 7 by-elections under Rishi Sunak. And if we can show you the roll call and show this to our viewers as well, the roll call of councils that you lost, Basildon, Dorset to the Lib Dems, North East Lincolnshire, Nuneaton, Redditch, these are places where Labour is salivating at the prospect of taking your MPs. You've been losing under Rishi Sunak time and again. Look, don't you think you need to change something?
Look, I'm not going to pretend they weren't disappointing results. It's always disappointing. I was out campaigning with lots of people across the country, and it's always disappointing when you lose hard-working Conservatives.
But the point here is, doesn't this give you evidence that you need to do something differently? And if you don't do anything differently, and you just say, stick to the plan, aren't you sticking your fingers in your ears when the electorate is telling you time and again they are not impressed?
No, look, I think the message, if you covered it on your piece there, the message from the election success in the Tees Valley was about having a plan, delivering on the plan, and I think at the moment we've made a lot of progress on those priorities I was talking about. You know, inflation's down to just over 3% from the 11%.
But the point there is that Ben Houchin in Tees Valley seems to have been able to communicate to his voters that he's able to achieve things. Rishi Sunak does not seem able to communicate to voters that he's achieving the things you claim. I want to put these to you. These are comments from some of your own council leaders who've lost. Andrew Jeffreys, former council leader of Thurrock Council, he said people were unhappy with the government. They didn't like the message that was coming out, the plan. So that's one of your own side who lost this week, is saying they don't like the national plan. Another, Andrew Baggott, who was leader of Basildon Council, he said there's a real immense dissatisfaction with people on the ground. What do you say to them? You're just not going to change anything?
No, what I would say is the plan is about delivering it. The plan is working. But we haven't. Well, but we haven't got all the way through to the end of it yet. So, take inflation. It was 11% when the Prime Minister became Prime Minister. It's now down to 3.1. It's not all the way down to the Bank of England's target of 2, when they'll start being able to cut interest rates, which will make a huge difference to hard-working families. We've done part of the plan on dealing with illegal migration. It's down by 30% year on year at a time the number of illegal migrants coming to the European Union was up, but we haven't completed that plan yet. We've got the Rwanda legislation through Parliament, opposed every step of the way by the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. You voted against it hundreds of times. But now we have it on the books. We can now get the flights going to Rwanda, a steady rhythm of flights. That will change the incentives there. It will have a deterrent effect, and will continue delivering on that policy. So it's about delivery.
So after these results, Mark Harper, and people will know and appreciate that you're a loyal minister, but after these results, you're not going to change anything. You're just going to stick to the plan, to use your phrase.
Well, we have a plan, and the plan is working.
But voters are telling you they don't like it.
But we're not all the way through yet. You've got to actually see... I think people want to see delivery, right? So they want to see inflation continue to come down. They want to see the boats stop. They want to see, for example, NHS waiting lists continue to fall. We've made a lot of progress on that, but we're not all of the way there yet. And I think people need to see the delivery of that plan.
But isn't the problem that the public is very clearly, from a whole run of elections and by-elections, the local council elections last year, by-election, these set of results, people clearly do not like what you're offering. And people in your own party, whether they're Paul Scully on one side or Suella Braverman on the other, they're saying now is the moment to have humility, to take a breath, and to think about doing things differently.
Look, I'm very clear about the results of the elections. We're not what we...
That's not my question. People will hear this morning, do you not see that people in your own party, as well as in the country, are saying, please do things differently?
The public want us to focus on the things they care about. And we can see very clearly, you refer to the polls a lot. The polls are very clear. The public care about the economy. We've had a pandemic.
Talking about real election results.
We've had a pandemic. We've had a war in Ukraine that drove up energy prices, where we had to stand behind the public on both of those. And that had a consequence for public spending. That had a consequence for not being able to reduce taxes as fast as we would like. But those were the right decisions, by the way, that the Prime Minister took when he was Chancellor, to back the country, to put that money into protecting millions of jobs, thousands of businesses. But they have consequences. People know they have to be paid for. So that's been a very difficult set of things to work through. So we're not yet at the point where people can see all the benefits. That's why we need to continue delivering on those priorities.
So you don't need to do anything differently. Sometimes, Mark Harper, the public gets to a point with the government where they stop listening, where it feels like the mood is so done, so exhausted. Do you worry that you might be at that stage now?
No, because I've been out on the doorstep across the country, from Cornwall to Tees Valley, talking to people and listening to them, importantly. And actually, they are engaging in these conversations. They want us to continue driving down inflation to help with the cost of living.
But if you were listening,
they want us to cut taxes,
but if you were listening
which we have been doing.
Wouldn't you, as Paul Scully and Suella Braverman have both said this morning, said this message from the public is so serious, we have to do something differently?
Well, look, it's quite clear, if you look at in a lot of races, very low turnouts, a lot of our voters for this set of elections did not come out and support our candidates. That's very clear. So we've got to make sure that when we get to the election is a choice. It's a choice between who's going to be Prime Minister at the end of the year, Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer. We've got to set out what we've delivered, what we're going to do going forward. We've got a plan. Labour doesn't have a plan. There's a lot at risk in that election, that people will go back to square one. They'll lose all the benefits that we've had in getting the public finances under control and cutting taxes. A Labour Party, for example, on migration, that's made it clear it isn't going to deport all of those people that have come to the country illegally. They'd effectively have an amnesty for that.
And we'll talk to Labour in just a second. I want, on the migration point you raised there, a bit later in the programme we'll hear from the Rwandan government. We've had an interview with the government spokesperson for the Rwandan government. She couldn't guarantee that Rwanda would be able to take all of the migrants that you wish to deport there. There are about 40,000 people in that category, and she could not guarantee that they would all be able to be processed and accommodated in Rwanda. Have you got a plan B?
Well, look, we've got a very clear plan to start flights going in 10 to 12 weeks. That's being worked on very clearly by the Home Office, and we want to get a steady rhythm of flights going to Rwanda through the balance of this year. And we'll continue working closely with the Rwandan government on the partnership agreement we've got that's got all of the safeguards in place that people want to see. And I think if you can set up a system of deterrent through those flights, you will break the business model of the groups, the organised crime groups that traffic people across a very dangerous waterway in the Channel. And I think that's what people want us to see. So we've reduced the number of people coming here illegally by a third at a time it's been going up in the European Union.
Well, that depends how you count it, Mark.
Well, no, it doesn't depend how you count it. If you compare last year to this year, it's down by a third. It was up heavily in the European Union. So we've made a lot of progress. But I accept there's still more to do, and the public want us to see us deliver on that very clear commitment.
OK, Mark Harper, thank you very much indeed for coming into the studio this morning. You've had an extremely busy few days and not enough sleep, so we're grateful to you for coming in. Thank you very much indeed. Well, Labour, unlike the Tories, have been celebrating this weekend. Yesterday afternoon, Sadiq Khan comfortably won a third term as Mayor of London. And then, after a series of nail-biting recounts, Richard Parker won to become the first Labour West Midlands Mayor. Phenomenal, said Keir Starmer.
The Tories felt that they were entitled to victory here, that they could use Andy Street as some sort of crutch for Rishi Sunak's weak leadership, and that they didn't have to be in touch with the priorities of the people. We ran a completely different campaign.
But it wasn't all rosy for Labour. It lost control of Oldham Council after losing seats to independent candidates who used to be in the party but quit over its position on the Gaza conflict. And Labour lost out to the Greens in Bristol, who've become the largest party there. Well, Pat McFadden, Labour's campaign chief, joins us now. Good morning. Thank you for coming in. Like Mark, you've not had much sleep, so we appreciate you putting your alarm on again. Now, let's start with where there were problems. You lost control of Oldham Council. You lost seat to the Greens in Newcastle and Bristol. Do you admit that the approach you took to Gaza has cost you?
Look, we've had tremendous results overall. If you take Oldham there, for example, which you mentioned, I think Gaza was a factor, but it's not the only one. There's some hyper-local issues in that local authority, which means we've lost seats there for a few years running, long before anything happened in Gaza. So I think it's a bit too easy to ascribe every difficult result just to one issue.
There have, though, been lots of places where there was evidence of that, where there were Labour councillors who have already quit the party over the position on the Middle East. And indeed, there was lots of evidence, lots of anecdotal evidence, as well as things like in the Birmingham mayoral contest in the West Midlands, of an independent candidate taking thousands of votes from you.
Well, you mentioned the West Midlands. An absolutely fantastic result for us, beyond our expectations. A real cliffhanger yesterday. Not only did we have excellent local election results across the country, but winning that mayoral contest against what I admit was quite a popular incumbent who had run his whole campaign by putting as much distance as he could between himself and Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party. An absolutely tremendous result for us in the West Midlands last night.
But there is an issue, though, is there not, with people's concern over the approach the leadership's taken to the Israel-Gaza conflict. And I want to show people and you a quote from Ali Milani, who's chair of the Labour Muslim Network, who's been looking across the country. He says, our positioning on Gaza is going to have a serious electoral consequence. If I was a Labour MP in Bradford, Birmingham, Leicester, or parts of London or Manchester, I would be seriously concerned. I mean, what do you say to that?
Look, I understand why people have got strong feelings about this issue. Thousands of people have been killed. There's a great impulse to help people who are in a terrible situation. That's something that we share.
But this is about Keir Starmer's position that he's taken. Lots of people in your party have wanted him to call directly for an immediate ceasefire from the start of this conflict, and many people objected to some of his language at the beginning and are not happy with the leadership's approach. What do you say to them?
What I would say to them is that the better life that people want for the Palestinian people is something the Labour leadership shares. If we're fortunate enough to be elected at the general election, it's a very high foreign policy priority for the Labour Party. Two things have guided us all the way through since October the 7th. The first was defending Israel's right to defend itself after that atrocity, and that remains part of our position. And the second is working to get a better future for the Palestinian people, and both of those things will guide our position going forward. So we understand why people have got strong feelings about this, and why wouldn't they when it's such a difficult and desperate situation?
Do you acknowledge that it has had electoral consequences for you already, and there are people in your party, like Ali bin Ali, who wonder and worry that there may be consequences for you in the general election if you don't change your approach?
I do acknowledge that in some parts of the country that was the case, and there were some people who maybe voted Labour in the past who haven't in the local elections because of this issue, and where that's the case, we'll work to get people's support back. But overall, I do have to stress, these were tremendous local election results, a tremendous by-election, and a set of mayoral elections that went beyond the expectations that we had.
Do you think that you have sealed the deal? Because if you look at the numbers overall, you're not cruising as Labour was in 1996 if you compare the national share of the vote.
It never felt like cruising at the time, I would say. But I would always say there's more work to do. I think what the results have given us this weekend is a sense of belief that sometimes the Labour Party hasn't had in recent years, because we've become used to losing. And I think even some of our voters have thought, well, I'll vote Labour, but they never win, because we didn't win in 2010 or 15 or 17 or 19, 4 general elections in a row. So there is a sense of belief there, but that sense of belief should never be confused with any sense that the job is done. Not a single vote has been cast in the general election that's to come. I think there's a mood of change in the country, and we have to meet it. And when people look at the Labour Party now, they can see a changed Labour Party compared to a few years ago. A Labour Party that is passing the essential tests of trust that the voters look for. Can you be trusted with public money? Can you be trusted with national security? We weren't passing those tests a few years ago. We're passing them today. And we are determined after this weekend to keep going and keep working to earn people's trust as we approach the general election.
Well, let's talk about another test that voters set for their politicians. We've been talking to the Rwandan government about the scheme for migration. Now, their spokesman said to us that if, like Labour, you don't like the scheme and you want to get rid of it, well, Keir Starmer would have to come up with another solution. So what would the solution be?
Well, I think the other thing that the Rwandan minister may have said is that she can't say how many people it would take. And part of our problem with the scheme is that it's a huge amount of money for a very small amount of people. And in response to this problem, which voters are rightly concerned about, you have to have a plan for the whole problem, not for 1% of it. This is only ever going to be a small part of the problem. We think the money being invested in this would be better spent on an international operation to really crack down on the criminal smuggling gangs who operate in an international way.
And that is exactly what the government would say it has already been doing. So what is your alternative? There are 40,000 people in the backlog who've come to this country without permission since the law was changed in 2023. What would Labour do with those people?
The Rwandan scheme will only ever apply to a tiny proportion of them.
If you get rid of the Rwandan scheme, what would you do?
To take the money that's being spent on it and spend that on a proper operation to crack down on the criminal gangs. A plan to address the whole of the problem, not 1% of it.
But on day one, if you do win the next election and the scheme is up and running, on day one, would you stop the flights?
Well, look, I think they'll get flights off, but we've always said we didn't think this scheme would work or that this scheme would be value for money for the taxpayer. It's costing upwards of £500 million.
But if it's up and running, and you may be sceptical about whether it can work, but if it's up and running and it works, would a Labour government, if you win, stop it on day one?
Well, we've said we'll divert the money to the international operation to the policing operation
That's
that
not
we've
my
talked
question.
about.
The question is, would you stop it immediately if it's working?
We don't want to continue with the scheme. We want to use the resources being spent on it to crack down on the international criminal gangs. We've been pretty clear about that all the way through.
But that's not quite the same as saying you would stop it immediately on day one. Or is that what you're saying and I'm missing the point?
Well, look, day one, you know, you do lots of things, but this is not a scheme we want to continue with. We want to take the resources being spent on it and use that to crack down on the international smuggling gangs.
And just lastly on this, if people had gone in large number or in any number to Rwanda, if the government succeeds in getting people to be processed as asylum seekers in that East African country, if you win, would you bring those people back?
I don't think we'd do that.
But that's a valid question because you've objected to the scheme all along. If you think it's so wrong and it's terrible to send people there, you wouldn't.
There are circumstances where they can be sent back, even under the current scheme. But no, I don't think we'd do that.
OK. Well, Pat McFadden, thank you very much indeed for coming in after a weekend where everyone in politics has been short on sleep, but we appreciate you coming in this morning. Thank you very much indeed. Well then, what did you think of all of that? Let us know. You can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. If you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag #BBCLauraK, and we will share some of your thoughts and comments later on in the show. And of course, there's always tons on the BBC website as we go along. So let's find out what our panel made of that. Paul Scully, firstly to you. We were talking to the Secretary of State, Mark Harper, after Suella Braverman's very strident criticism and demand for a change of approach. Did you hear anything from Mark Harper that suggests he gets it, that he's understood the message from voters?
What I took from both of those interviews is that Suella has sort of tended to be known for an ideological approach to her politics. Mark is a very effective Secretary of State, tends to be very process-driven, and the two aren't really talking to each other. There's no narrative, no cohesion around what we're doing as a party. So he's right that we've got to stick to the plan. He's right that we're talking about, in the 5 pledges that the Prime Minister came up with last year, the economy, healthcare, NHS, and stopping the boats. But where's the narrative? What do people think why we're here to do what we're doing? There's no vision for the future. And that's what I think I want us to be concentrating on for the next few months to the general election. Where's the vision for the next 5 years? We can't just win an election for the sake of winning an election. You've got to have a purpose.
And do you buy this idea that he said it's all to play for, that you're still in the game?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with that in terms of winning the election, but what I do think, absolutely, we've got to fight for every seat because there is going to be a Conservative Party the day after the election, and we've got to rebuild that narrative that I was talking about, that broad coalition that we used to have. We need good people there to do it. So I hope that individual candidates will be able to put their stall across at the general election so that we've got a good, thriving party that can see its future.
Pippa, what did you think?
Well, I think Mark Harper did a valiant job, actually, after a really difficult set of results. And, this whole thing about sticking to the plan, the economy is at the heart of all of it. And the government clearly hopes that people will feel a little bit better off when inflation drops again, interest rates start to come down, and possibly an autumn statement from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, with another tax cut, another national insurance cut, that by the time we get to the autumn and a general election, people will be feeling that little bit better off. The problem is that some of that economic hardship is baked in. I mean, inflation already has been very high. People are already struggling with their bills. And public services, the picture is pretty grim as well. So people are not in a place where they are going to be listening to messages to stick with the plan and things are going to get better. And I think the Tories have reached the end of the road, really, when it comes to the public feeling that they can believe that they're going to, improve their lives. There's very little, I think, given, not least because of the reputational damage inflicted by Boris Johnson and Liz Truss on the party brand. I think there's very little now that the Conservatives can do to turn that round.
Paul, is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, look, we've got to learn the lessons from 97. I joined the party in 97 in the immediate aftermath. I was that weirdo that joined straight after the election.
You've seen people in politics are weirdos. That's a
who'd
terrible thing to say.
Perish the thought. But you know what? Because what I saw at the time was that people just stopped listening. And it just feels, as Pippa says, that's happening now. So that's what I'm talking about, the humility. How do we start to shorten that process and make sure that we can make people feel that benefit that Mark was talking about, that is actually there in terms of the economy turning around, but they're not feeling it yet.
Jackie, you're rolling your eyes.
Well, I'm rolling my eyes because what we've seen this morning essentially is Suella Braverman, Mark and Paul sort of wrestling for the future of the Conservative Party, whilst British people, as Pippa rightly says, are paying record levels of taxation, can't get a hospital appointment or a GP appointment, see their kids' schools crumbling, and are worried about whether or not the country is going in the right direction. The only answer is a completely fresh start, a general election. Of course, there is a continued challenge for Labour to make sure that they achieve the results that will allow that Labour government to make that change. But it's clear that the Tory party have run out of steam. And I was talking to somebody yesterday who said to me, actually, if they really do care for our country, they need to recognise that themselves, call a general election and let that change start now.
But a big chunk of this is actually baked in because of COVID and the cost of living crisis that's exacerbated by Ukraine. You see that with incumbents across the world, elections that are happening across the world. Undoubtedly, as I've said, we have shot ourselves in the foot a few times. I'm not, using that as an overall excuse. But there are no easy answers. I don't think they're going to be coming in from an incoming Labour government. Which is
there aren't any easy answers, Paul. Which is why we need a government that is focused on the future of the country rather than trying, fighting their internal battles in public, as we've seen this morning.
It was interesting, though, Pippa. I mean, Suella Braverman absolutely, spitting feathers about how bad things have got in her view and really pushing for a change in direction. But it does seem that Tory rebels who had been discussing and planning what to do after this weekend, it does seem as if they've given up. Is that what you're hearing?
Absolutely. Ever since Andrea Jenkins, who's one of the few MPs, or in fact the two MPs, I think, who's publicly said that they've put in a letter to try and get rid of Rishi Sunak, went on the Today programme on Friday morning, I think it was, and said, well, actually, she didn't see now that there was any point in this and that she thought that that people had to come in behind the Prime Minister. Nadine Dorries, another prominent critic, tweeting that, everyone needs to get in behind the Prime Minister now and come together. The heat has definitely gone out of any rebellion, if there was ever a big enough rebellion, frankly, to get rid of Rishi Sunak in the first place, which I doubt. And but I think what those interviews, in particular Suella Braverman, showed is, and actually the irony of it, really, her coming on and saying, let's all unite. She has been one of the key individuals behind all of this.
That was her leadership campaign.
Stirring the pot and causing trouble for Rishi Sunak. And that's one of the biggest problems Tories face across the board, actually, is that people look at them and think they're more concerned about fighting amongst themselves than actually focusing on our issues and our problems.
And is that unification is absolutely at the heart of it, because she was absolutely right, Suella, when she talked about voters being on strike. It is about depressing our turnout, and which we've seen over the last few days.
And I just briefly, Paul, want to ask you wanted to be the candidate for London Mayor. If you had been chosen, do you think you could have won it?
It was always going to be difficult, but I think I could have run it closer because you needed a positive vision. Again, in London, it's one of the most aspirational places in the world. You needed a good aspirational view about housing, about crime, about transport, about the quality of life in London. It's a global city as well. We did botch the selection and the campaign, as Suella said earlier on, and that's to my regret because I love London. It's it's my home city.
What a strange campaign for the Tories to run. We really, really hate London. Why don't you let us run it?
And that just
you would have done a better job. You'd still have lost, but you'd have made a more graceful defeat
I'll
speech.
take that as a win then.
Well, who knows?
Jackie,
Jackie, let's talk about Labour. So we talked to Pat McFadden about what has been a real cost for them is how their leadership has looked at the Israel-Gaza conflict. Rightly or wrongly, it has cost them votes. How serious a problem do you think that might be?
Well, I think what you've heard from Labour politicians across the weekend is a real commitment to say, look, we know that people feel enormously strongly about Gaza. We know it's influencing their vote and giving them concerns within the Labour Party. And we're determined to listen to that and think about our approach. But actually what it also shows you is, I think it's interesting when people say you should decide your foreign policy on the basis of what's going to make the people within your party feel happy. Wrong. You should make your foreign policy on the basis that you're going to be the Prime Minister in the future, and actually what you want is, as we heard from Pat, is a policy that both protects Israel's right to exist and recognises the enormous damage done on October the 7th, and provides a long-term future for the people of Gaza, who are suffering so horrifically at the moment.
But do you believe it could actually cost Labour seats in the general election? Because from what you say and from what Pat McFadden says, they're not going to change their approach. They've talked about listening, but they're not going to change.
Well, they're not going to change the approach because it's the right one. But Will it cost seats? Probably, well, it may in a very few, I don't know. But I think what you need to do when you go into a general election is do the right thing by the country, and then you need to make sure within the party that you're explaining the reasons why you're doing things and you're engaging and you're not taking people for granted, which I think some groups within the party, including those, for example, who may have voted Green for reasons to do with climate change, that those people aren't being taken for granted and their voices are being heard.
Pippa.
Well, I think that Labour can withstand losses in some of its strongholds. I mean, you've got seats in London, for example, where they've got majorities of 30,000, 40,000. So they could stand losing some of those votes. But I think the general election picture is different in terms of people will be seeing it as a two-horse race, ultimately, in large swathes of the country. Obviously, there's bits of, there's other parts of the country where the Lib Dems are snapping at the Tories' heels. But Labour, it's not just about the seats in England, of course. Scotland, which is generally the seats that it's fighting, slightly more progressive than the rest of the UK. So they'll need to watch out there that some of these positions on these issues don't have a negative impact for them. They want to be able to take lots of seats in Scotland. And there have been some missteps in some of their handling. I mean, the early communications around the Gaza issue, the way that they handled the 28 billion issue, it hasn't all been smooth sailing. So far, they've withstood that, but they could be, they need to watch out in the run-up to the election that there aren't any more serious missteps, which the Tories then capitalise on, because Keir Starmer has tried to present himself as Mr Reassurance, and anything which rocks the boat on that could be a problem and capitalised on by the Tories.
And just quickly, Jackie, you were very much part of, Labour's march back to power in the late 90s. Does this feel like 97 to you or not?
Well, first of all, Pat was absolutely right. It didn't feel like coasting to power at the time, can I say. There was an enormous amount of discipline and some very clear messaging. I feel confident but not complacent about Labour's chances. But the sooner we get a general election, the better. OK, all three of you, thanks for now. And at the end of the programme, we'll be talking about the smaller parties because they had important and interesting results too. But you can bet the Conservatives, we've heard it this morning, will keep hammering the message about immigration and their plan to get planes of asylum seekers off to Rwanda. But even if they do make it down the runway, will it solve the problem? 40,000 migrants have arrived in the UK without permission since the law was changed. But can the East African country guarantee that they will provide homes for them all? I've been speaking to Yolande Makolo from the Rwandan government, and I asked her, how many migrants is Rwanda ready for?
Along the lifetime of this partnership, which is initially 5 years, we expect to relocate thousands. But this will be, staggered so that we can manage it properly, and will be discussed with our partners, especially in the ramp-up phase.
How many people do you think you could accommodate initially?
This is something that we'll discuss as we go along this partnership with our colleagues in the UK. There's been a misconception about this 200 number, and we've tried to explain it. Journalists have been visiting the initial accommodations that we have secured since the beginning of the partnership. This is Hope Hostel. That particular facility is able to take up to 200 people. However, we've already started initial discussions with other facilities around Kigali and further afield, and these will be firmed up and signed once we know how many migrants are coming and when they're coming. So it's never been the case that we can only take 200 initially. That has been a misconception.
Can't you give a guarantee that you'd be able to process the tens of thousands of people that the government would like to send to Rwanda?
We will be able to welcome the migrants that the UK sends over the lifetime of this partnership. What I cannot tell you is how many thousands we're taking in the first year or in the second year. This will depend on very many factors that are being worked out right now.
But there's huge debate here about whether Rwanda is a safe country to send people to. On Friday, at least 9 people were killed after a camp in the Democratic Republic of Congo was bombed. Now, the American State Department has blamed your Rwandan army and a rebel group known as M23. Was your country involved?
But not at all. I mean, look at what the people themselves in the camps have been saying. They know that the Congolese army, the DRC army, has had heavy artillery near the IDP camps. The NGOs that work there have been complaining and requesting, including the UN, has been asking the DRC government to move this heavy artillery away from these IDP camps. They didn't, and this is what happened.
Yet the State Department has pointed the finger at the Rwandan army and that group M23 you've been accused many times of backing. Why is the US State Department wrong?
Well, they've been very hasty to blame us without investigating this incident and without talking to the people who were affected. It's something that we outright reject, and it's unfair.
Many human rights groups express real concerns about rights and freedoms in Rwanda, about the safety of gay or transgender people there, for example. And the British Foreign Office advises LGBT travellers they can experience abuse and discrimination. What assurances can you give that they would be protected?
That just does not speak to the reality of Rwanda at all.
The Foreign Office is wrong.
I don't know what document you're referring to, but everybody in Rwanda, we believe in non-discrimination. Discrimination is what almost destroyed this country in 1994. We have built back this country on the basis of unity and non-discrimination on any basis. Rwanda does not discriminate against people of different sexual or gender orientation, not at all. Everyone can feel protected by the law here. And it's not illegal to be gay in Rwanda. We have no legislation against homosexuality in this country. So it is a wrong reading of the situation in Rwanda. That is not the reality.
So the UK Foreign Office has got that wrong.
They need to review that.
The leader of the UK Labour Party, Keir Starmer, says he'd get rid of the Rwanda scheme if he becomes Prime Minister. What would you say to him?
I'm not going to speak to UK domestic politics. What I can tell you is that we are serious about offering people a home, and we're doing it for the right reasons. People can oppose this partnership and this program if they want to, but Rwanda should not be criticized unjustly. And then they should also come up with another solution that's innovative and that's not just deterrence and enforcement. People are suffering here, so we need good solutions, and we need to rethink the migration crisis.
Do you think sometimes people have an unfair idea about what Rwanda's like?
Yes, I think Rwanda has been attacked unjustly. We have worked very hard in this country to get to where we are. After basically an apocalypse in 1994, where we lost over 1 million Rwandans, we have built back, and we want to do more. We want to do more with our partners in the region and beyond, including the UK, to ensure that Rwandans are able to fulfill their potential and to develop this continent and to contribute to global problems like migration, for instance. So yes, we are attacked unjustly, and living in Rwanda is not a punishment. It's a beautiful country, including the weather. Everything about this country is much better than it's ever been in its history, and it's a great country to be in and to work for. And we hope that the people who come to live here with us will feel the same way.
Well, let us see what happens with that whole scheme over time. But let's return as we race towards the end of the programme to our main story. Now, we talked a lot about Tories and Labour. Of course, there was the Lib Dems, the Green, Reform putting up lots of candidates across the country too. And the Lib Dems, Pippa, ended up actually with more councillors than the Tories. How well did they do?
They did very well, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because if we're making comparisons to 1997, Paddy Ashdown was a big beast, and he was, made it quite clear that he had a relationship with Labour going into the election. We haven't heard so much from Ed Davey. They're taking a much quieter approach, but it seems to be working, given that they've taken Tunbridge Wells, Tory heartlands. They've taken Dorset Council as well. They took control from the Conservatives. And I think what we're inevitably going to see, there's lots of talks about sort of progressive alliances and voters and tactical voting. I think what we've seen in all these by-elections and in these council elections is the voters can work it out themselves. Exactly. And we're likely to see it writ large, I think, across the so-called blue wall, across the areas where the Lib Dems and the Tories are up against each other. As Labour voters, Green voters, other parties' voters decide that they'll back the Lib Dems. And I think we'll probably see a few what we call Portillo moments, where there's some big Tory beasts in some of those seats. Michael Gove's name's been mentioned, Jeremy Hunt's name's been mentioned, there are others having sort of a political decapitation strategy.
Paul, how worried should your colleagues be, or how worried are your colleagues about being taken out by the Lib Dems and maybe with a nudge from other kinds of voters too?
Well, this is what I mean about the fact that we should take every seat, really seriously, despite my sort of slightly negative prognosis of the general election. Ed Davey, you talk about Paddy Ashdown back in the day. Ed Davey's playing, I think, with inflatable dinosaurs or something was his latest stunt at the moment.
He does love a photo call, that's true.
The party has definitely changed. We actually won a by-election, council by-election on Thursday, where the Lib Dems snapping out a hill. They run the council, they have done for 40 years, but they can't make inroads on what was a Labour seat that we won from them.
But what about the Greens, Jackie? Do you think Labour, that sort of activist vote, where people are unhappy with the Middle East we've talked about, but also they want Labour to be bolder on the environment?
Well, first of all, there are all sorts of reasons why in a local council election people can vote in different ways. Perhaps because this is something that is really important locally,
the bins,
but also indeed, or local planning issues, all sorts of things. But that isn't going to influence the overall direction of the country. When we get eventually to a general election, people will have to ask themselves the question: do we want a Labour government or do we want a Conservative government? And to be honest, if you are concerned about the environment, if you're interested in social justice, if you want the sorts of things that people who are probably voting Green for at the moment, the only way you're going to get that delivered in the country is if you elect a Labour government. And I think that will be the battle, notwithstanding, as I suggested earlier, that Labour will need to explain clearly to people how, despite recent changes in policy, they will make a difference that this government have failed to do on climate change.
But they need to tell that story more clearly. Paul, just lastly to you about Reform. So Reform is the party that has come out of the ancestors, the Brexit Party and UKIP. They came within a whisker of beating the Tories into third place in the Blackpool South by-election. How worried should your party be about the threat from the right, maybe even with the Nigel Farage comeback?
Well, look, Reform are the opposite end of the Lib Dems. They're both, they're sitting there wagging a finger, blaming people without any actual solutions. So, yes, we've got to focus on that palpable anger and frustration of voters, which are, but, as the corollary of what Jackie was saying, if they want true Conservatives in government and in Parliament, they're not going to get it through Reform.
But isn't the problem you're going to get squeezed from both sides and when actually the votes are stacking up?
Well, that's what I'm talking about, having a vision. If we don't have a vision, then absolutely we will get squeezed, but let's have the vision in the first place.
If you want a nightmare vision, imagine Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage in some sort of strange arrangement, which at least one of the newspapers was talking about today.
I don't want to think about strange arrangements for those two at all.
Well, all three of you, thank you so much for your time this morning. Let's hear from you. You've been busy getting in touch. Charles in Anglesey says, I think it's quite simple. Voters want change. John in Liverpool says the Tories have not lost support because of Rishi Sunak. They have lost it because of the chaos that preceded him. Annalise has been in touch, though, to say Suella is spot on, in my opinion. I really hope Sunak properly listens. Well, whatever happens, it's going to be an eventful few weeks and months ahead. Thank you to my trio at the desk. Thank you for your company on a really important weekend when we've been trying to work out what the thousands of winners and losers across the country means for what comes next. We sketched out the nightmare facing Rishi Sunak and the chance in front of Keir Starmer. These results do not prove that Labour will get a majority, and we cannot say it often enough that in political time, the general election is centuries away. But there's no question the Tories are in deep, deep trouble, however much they want to acknowledge that in public. A bit later, I'll be on Newscast on BBC Sounds with Paddy O'Connell. There he is. Oh, give us a wave. Very friendly they are on Radio 4. We'll be together on BBC Sounds later. You can watch anything again, of course, on iPlayer. And I'll look forward to seeing you here next Sunday, same time, same place.
Discover unique stories,